Picture a lounge room in Melbourne in 1956, the radio glowing amber on the sideboard, the refrigerator humming in the kitchen, the washing machine out in the laundry, the brand new television in the corner, the whole family gathered around it, and by the back door, leaning on the fence, the push bike. Now here is the strange part. Every single one of those things was made by the same company, one name, one Australian family, Healing. It had survived the depression that broke half its rivals. It had built a factory in wartime against the law to help arm the country. For the better part of 80 years, it filled every room of the Australian home. And then it was gone. The name, the family, the factory, all of it. So completely that today there is not even a plaque. How does an empire that touched every Australian life just vanish? Before we go any further, if you want to keep these stories alive, I've created a book with the complete Australian lost factories, the workers, the gates, the Australian maid, all gone. The link is on the first line of the description. Back to the story. Chapter 1. The Boy with 50 Borrowed Pounds. The honest truth is that the record is thin on the man himself. Alfred George. Healing was born in Richmond in inner Melbourne on the 23rd of August 1868. We know he played exactly one senior game of football for Melbourne in 1897, a single afternoon in the Guernsey, and then out of the game and into the rest of his life. And here is a small measure of how strangely this country remembers its own. Today, in the reference books, Alfred Healing is filed first as a footballer who played one match, and only second, almost as an afterthought, as the man who built one of the largest manufacturing companies in the nation. The diaries, the photographs, the private letters that would let you really know him do not survive. There is something fitting in that, because by the end of this story, the man and the company he built will both have been very nearly erased from the country they served. Hold on to that. It becomes the whole point. What we do have is the work. The 1890s were the years of the great bicycle boom, a sudden, almost hysterical national appetite for the machine, the first time an ordinary working person could own transport that did not eat, did not tire, and did not need stabling. In 1896, Healing took on the Victorian agency for an English bicycle called the Haddon, selling and repairing them from a shop on Bridge Road, Richmond. For a decade, he had a partner, a man named E.A. Summers. That partnership dissolved in 1904, with Summers taking the New Zealand side of the business. And then there is the origin story that follows Healing through every account, too good not to tell. An ordering error, so it goes, left him holding roughly twice the bicycle parts he could pay for and no way to settle the bill. So he loaded up and cycled around Victoria, selling the surplus stock town by town, and in doing it, discovered the thing that made him. The market was enormous. The whole country wanted bicycles and almost nobody was building them properly. Here is the number to remember, because everything in this story is measured against it. In 1907, Alfred Healing borrowed £50 from his sister and opened his own shop. £50, not from a bank, from his sister. By 1912, it was a proper proprietary company in Niagara Lane, about 50 people on the books, and the bicycles were pouring out, 25,000 a year at the peak, each one stamped with a badge Australians would come to know on sight. There is a detail worth pausing on. Healing did not come from money. There was no family fortune behind him, no wealthy backer, no inheritance to fall back on if it all went wrong. The whole enterprise rested on £50 and a sister's faith in her brother. In an age when the big industrial names were so often built on old capital, this was rarer and more Australian, a working man's company, started from nothing, that would grow to touch almost everything. Within a decade, that £50 shop would be the biggest motorcycle maker in the country. Chapter 2. The Winged H. Before the radios, before the televisions, before any of it, Healing built the things you rode. By the end of the First World War, A.G. Healing was the largest motorcycle business in Australia. It sold under its own marque, the Petrol, and under names like Peerless and Precision, dropping imported engines, FN, Fafnir, JAP, into locally built frames. But it was the humble bicycle that made the company part of the furniture of Australian life. The winged H head badge, that little stamped emblem on the front of the frame, went out across the country by the tens of thousands. 25,000 machines a year. On the red dirt roads of the bush and the bluestone lanes of Melbourne, a Healing was simply what a bicycle was, and it was good enough to win at the highest level there is. The Australian Sports Museum still holds a racing frame built by Healing and ridden by Russell Mockridge, the Victorian cyclist who at the 1952 Helsinki Olympics won 2 gold medals in a single games, the 1,000-metre time trial and the tandem. Mockridge would die young, struck by a bus during a road race in 1958, and the loss was mourned across the country. But the frame remains, and think about what it means. The same company that would one day put a refrigerator in your kitchen built a machine that carried an Australian to a double Olympic gold. The champion Nino Borsari was associated with the marque too. This was not a tin pot outfit turning out rattletraps. This was a serious maker of serious things. The money followed the machines. In 1926, the firm went public, and along the way it absorbed an automotive parts distributor called Duncan & Company, widening its reach into a country just beginning to buy the motor car. Alfred Healing became governing director in 1927, the boss in name as well as fact, and he would run the place until the day he died. Here's the thing about a company like this. It grew by reading the country correctly over and over again. Bicycles when the country wanted bicycles, motorcycles when it wanted those, motor parts when the car arrived. Each time, Healing looked hard at how ordinary Australians were actually living and built the thing they were about to need next. It was a genius for the everyday, and it was about to find its greatest expression yet. And you have to understand what a bicycle and a motorcycle actually meant in that Australia. The motorcar was still a rich man's toy, out of reach for most working families well into the 1920s. For the ordinary person, a Healing was not a hobby or a bit of weekend exercise. It was how you got to work, how a country doctor reached a farmhouse, how a nation of limited means first tasted the freedom of simply being able to move. Healing was, quite literally, selling independence to people who had never before been able to afford it. And that racing pedigree was the proof stamped on the tin. If it was good enough to win a gold medal, it was good enough for your boy's first two-wheeler. Because a new sound was coming into the Australian lounge room, and Healing set out to own it. Chapter 3. The Golden Voice. In the 1930s, the wireless was the hearth. Before television, before anything on a screen, the family radio was the thing a household gathered around of an evening. The news, the serials, the cricket, the voice in the corner of the room that tied a farmhouse in the Mallee to the rest of the living world. To own a good one was to have the century itself delivered into your front room. Healing decided it would make that voice. It began in 1933 by importing American Atwater Kent sets, models with plain numbers, the 20s and 30s and 50s and 70s of the range. But once the tariff walls went up, the protective duties that made it cheaper to build at home than to bring one in from abroad, Healing did what Healing always did. It stopped importing and started manufacturing. And it gave its radios a name that was pure marketing genius, a name that promised the thing itself, the Golden Voice. Picture one on the sideboard, the polished timber cabinet, the fabric grille, and the dial, glowing a warm amber in the half-dark of the lounge, the little needle sliding across the station names while the valves warmed and the sound swelled up into the room. For a generation of Australians, that glow was the colour of home. In the evening, it was the first Healing product that truly lived in every house. Not a thing you rode out in the shed, but a thing at the very centre of the family's day, the object the whole household turned toward when the light failed. And the business behind it was booming in the least likely years imaginable. By 1938, the Melbourne Works employed around 550 people, with big assembly plants in Sydney and Adelaide feeding the other states. The company turned a net profit that year of £34,701, serious money, and it was still climbing. By 1951, the annual profit had reached £88,000. Remember, these were the years still shadowed by the Great Depression, the years that closed the gates of manufacturer after manufacturer across the country. Healing wasn't merely surviving the hard times, it was growing fat on them. The £50 shop had become a national manufacturer with its product in the very heart of the home. It had ridden the bicycle boom, the motorcycle boom, and now the radio boom, each wave bigger than the last. And then the world stopped, and there was a deeper logic hidden in that switch from importing to making, one that would echo down through the rest of the century. A tariff does not simply tax a foreign radio, it creates a space, behind a wall, in which a local factory can exist at all. A space in which Australians can be paid Australian wages to build Australian things, and still sell them at a price the public will actually pay. Every job on the Golden Voice line, every one of those 550 people, lived inside that protected space. And nobody ever thought about it because you never think about the wall you are standing behind. Not until the day somebody decides to pull it down. Because the war came, and healing turned from making the sound of peace to making the tools of survival. Chapter 4. The Factory Built Against the Law. In February 1942, Singapore fell, and the war came down onto Australia's own doorstep. Suddenly, a country at the far end of the earth discovered it could not import its way out of danger. Everything it needed, it would now have to make for itself, and it was desperately short of the one thing that makes all other manufacturing possible: machine tools. The lathes and precision equipment that cut and shape metal to 1/1000th of an inch. Without them, you cannot build a weapon, an engine, a gun barrel, or an aircraft part. A nation without machine tools is a nation that cannot defend itself. So Healing became a toolmaker for the war. At its Franklin Street works in Melbourne, the company began building capstan lathes, copied from a design by the English engineering firm Alfred Herbert. And here we have one of the very few real, documented human threads in the whole story. A man named Percy Fry, who worked for Healing at the time, had carried the design drawings for that lathe out from the United Kingdom in his own luggage. One of the lathes he helped to build, made at Franklin Street around 1942, survives to this day in the collection of Museums Victoria, which records plainly that there was a critical shortage of machine tools in Australia at this time, and that Melbourne firms like Healing started making them to keep the war effort alive. There are also reports, and I'll be honest, that this rests on a single secondary source, so I give it to you as reported rather than confirmed, that Healing manufactured radar equipment during the war years. But the most extraordinary thing Healing did in the war was build a factory it was not allowed to build. In 1943 and 1944, it raised a large new plant at Kensington on Racecourse Road, and it is a genuinely beautiful thing, in the streamlined modern style, all curved corners and clean horizontal sweeps, designed by the architects Sidney Smith, Ogg and Serple, and built by Thompson and Chalmers. And it went up, according to the Heritage Record, in direct contravention of a Melbourne City Council bylaw that had set that very land aside for housing. There was a war on. The rules bent. A factory rose where homes were meant to go, and the whole of it was given over to the war effort. When the fighting stopped, that plant turned to making machine tools and precision parts for cars and motorcycles. Remember that building. It is still standing, and this is the bitter irony sitting underneath the whole chapter. The Kensington factory was raised for two purposes: to help win the war, and to seize the enormous boom that everyone knew was coming after it. A country cannot fight a total war without a manufacturing base, and the men who built that plant against the bylaw understood correctly that the piece would belong to whoever could make things at scale. They were building for a future of Australian making that felt, in 1944, absolutely inevitable. They could not possibly have imagined that the very same country would one day simply decide it no longer needed to make things at all. But Alfred Healing would not live to see the empire he had built reach its peak. Chapter 5. Every Room in the House. On the 18th of February, 1945, with the war all but won, Alfred George Healing died at Kew at the age of 76. Some accounts say 77. The arithmetic says 76. Either way, the boy with the 50 borrowed pounds was gone, and by then even his obituary could fairly call A.G. Healing one of the largest manufacturing companies in the entire country. His son Keith, who had come into the firm back in 1921 as an apprentice bicycle maker, learning the trade from the floor up, carried the company forward into its golden age. And what an age it was! This is the part that makes Healing different from every other lost Australian factory, because most of them made one thing. A mower, a biscuit, a car, Healing made everything. Through the middle of the 1950s, Healing signed a run of manufacturing licenses with American giants and brought their products to Australia under those famous names. It built televisions in alliance with Dumont of New Jersey, one of the pioneers of the American set. It made washing machines under the Thor name. It made refrigerators under the Crosley name. By 1956, the company was reported to be running 5 manufacturing plants, and it advertised its full range to the nation across the pages of the Australian Women's Weekly, the magazine on every kitchen table in the land. So go back to that 1956 lounge room from the very start of this story. The golden voice radio on the sideboard was Healing. The refrigerator humming in the kitchen was Healing. The washing machine out in the laundry was Healing. The television the family is gathered around was Healing. And the bicycle by the back door, the one the kids learned to ride on, was Healing. One company had quietly moved into every single room of the Australian house, not as the supplier of one appliance, but as the maker of the entire modern life a post-war family was assembling for itself. Read that again, because no other name in this country's history ever managed it. Your entertainment, your food, your washing, your children's freedom. One badge on all of it, glowing on the sideboard, humming in the kitchen, leaning by the door. It looked, from the outside, completely and permanently unstoppable. And the timing of the television was extraordinary. Australian television began only in 1956, Sydney that September, Melbourne that November, in time for the Melbourne Olympic Games. Healing was present at the very birth of the medium, putting sets into lounge rooms in the first months that there was anything at all to watch on them. To a family in 1956, a Healing television was a window that had just been cut into the wall of the house, and it was Healing that had cut it. But look at how it was doing all this, because the seed of the ending hides inside the triumph. The televisions were built under a Dumont license. The washers were Thor. The fridges were Crosley. In these glamorous new categories, Healing was no longer the inventor or the owner. It was an assembler of other people's designs, renting its success from American firms. In the boom years, with demand outrunning supply, that looked like pure cleverness. It would not always be the boom years, and it was about to make the first of 3 fatal mistakes. Chapter 6. The Product That Built It. Here is where the tragedy begins, and I want you to notice something about it from the start. There is no villain in it, no corporate raider, no foreign predator creeping up on the company in the dark, no asset stripper with a spreadsheet. The first wound Healing did entirely to itself. On the 14th of August, 1959, Healing sold its bicycle division. All of it across every state in the country to an English-controlled firm called General Accessories Proprietary Limited. The logic in the boardroom of the day would have sounded almost obvious. Bicycles were the past. Televisions and refrigerators were the glittering future. Why tie up capital and floor space making push bikes when the whole country was crying out for white goods and screens? So they let the bicycles go to concentrate on the modern, high-margin appliance business. But think for a moment about what they had actually sold. The bicycle was the founding product. The bicycle was the thing Alfred had built with his sister's £50. The winged H head badge was the oldest and most trusted possession the company owned. The emblem that had put the Healing name into Australian hands decades before anyone had heard of a Golden Voice radio. Russell Mockridge had won Olympic gold on a Healing frame. 60 years of goodwill sat in that little badge. And they sold it, sold the one product that had never once let them down, to chase categories where they were merely a licensee, assembling other men's designs under license. Now a company is allowed to change. Markets move, and a maker that refuses to move dies of nostalgia in the end. But there is a world of difference between evolving and cutting away your own roots. Healing did not diversify away from the bicycle. It amputated the bicycle. It chose to keep the parts of the business where it was weakest, dependent on American licenses, exposed to every new competitor who cared to enter. And it sold off the one part where it was strongest and most completely itself, and most trusted by the public. In 1959, it would have felt like sensible pruning, a tidying of the portfolio. It reads now like the first deep cut in something much worse, the moment a great company began, without quite realizing it, to dismantle itself. And there is a human cost buried in that decision that the boardroom would never have counted. Somewhere in the company were the men who built bicycles, the frame builders and the wheel lacers, the men who had brazed the winged H onto 60 years of Australian childhoods. That was craft, handed down and held in the hands. When the division went to General Accessories, that skill went with it, or it went nowhere at all. A company can sell a division with a single stroke of a pen. What it can never do is buy back the accumulated pride and knowledge of the people who made the thing that built it. Healing had just traded away the one part of itself that it truly knew how to do, in exchange for the parts it was only ever renting. Because 2 years later, it bet its entire future on something it knew absolutely nothing about. Chapter 7. Locomotives. In 1961, A.G. Healing, maker of radios, refrigerators, washing machines and televisions, bought a locomotive works. Let that sit for a moment, because it is one of the strangest turns in Australian corporate history. The takeover became effective on the 5th of January 1961, and the company Healing swallowed was A.E. Goodwin Limited, a heavy engineering firm out of Sydney, founded in December 1935 by an engineer named Arthur Elliott Goodwin. Goodwin held the Australian licence to build the great American Alco diesel locomotives, and it turned them out by the hundreds: the New South Wales 44 class, the 45 class, and later the 442 class, from works at Auburn and St Mary's and Lidcombe. This was enormous, capital-hungry heavy industry. Cast steel and diesel engines and rolling stock that weighed 100 tonnes a unit. And it had nothing whatsoever, to do with putting a television set in a suburban lounge room. You have to ask what they could possibly have been thinking. The kindest reading is that Healing dreamed of becoming a great diversified conglomerate, the sort of sprawling industrial group that made everything from a toaster to a train, and that heavy engineering looked like the muscular, serious, permanent future. But a household appliance company and a locomotive builder are opposite creatures in every way that matters. The appliance business runs on high volume, fast turnover, consumer fashion, and thin margins spread across millions of small, everyday sales. A locomotive works runs on the exact reverse. A handful of gigantic, lumpy government contracts, years in the building, savagely cyclical, where one delayed order or one technical failure can swallow a whole year's profit at a gulp. The two businesses demanded opposite instincts, opposite balance sheets, opposite temperaments. Healing understood the first one in its bones. It understood the second one not at all. So look at what the company had done to itself in the space of just 2 years. It had sold the bicycle it knew everything about, and it had bought a locomotive works it understood nothing about. It had turned its back on its single greatest strength and walked with its eyes open straight into its single greatest weakness. And all the while, the appliance business at home was getting harder by the year. Those American licenses that had looked so shrewd in 1956 meant Healing was assembling designs it did not own, in a market that fresh competitors were beginning to flood. Behind everything, the heavy engineering gamble was quietly filling with risk. The 1960s were the great age of the conglomerate, and you can almost hear the boardroom logic that led them in. Spread across enough different industries, the theory went, and no single downturn can hurt you. Buy up serious heavy industry, and the market treats you as a serious industrial power. It was fashionable thinking the world over. But fashion is not the same thing as fit. Goodwin had built more than 400 locomotives between the mid-1950s and the early 1970s, a genuine achievement in its own world. The problem was never that Goodwin was bad at building locomotives. The problem was that building locomotives had nothing whatsoever to teach a company about selling refrigerators, and everything to teach it how much money a single bad contract can quietly burn. By 1969, the bill came due, and it was almost $24 million. Chapter 8. Almost $24 million. In 1969, A.G. Healing posted a loss of almost $24 million and went into receivership. Almost $24 million. Let that number sit for a moment. This was a company that, 3 decades earlier, had counted a £34,000 profit as a very good year indeed. Now it was bleeding on a scale that ended it as an independent, healthy business. The figure comes to us through the reporting of the day, the Canberra Times, in August 1969, running a story under the headline, Concern over Healing Plan. And I have to be straight with you about the edges of what we actually know. The records do not cleanly tell us how much of that catastrophic loss came from the heavy engineering adventure and how much from the appliance business drowning under imports. So I will not invent a split for you. The loss was real, it was enormous, and it broke the company's back. That much is beyond doubt. Now, here is where I have to stop and gently correct the story you have very likely already told yourself. Because there is a simple, satisfying version of what killed Healing, and it runs like this. Cheap Japanese electronics came flooding in, undercut a proud old Australian maker and destroyed it. It is a clean story. It has a villain. And it is wrong, or at the very least, it is nowhere near the whole truth. Read that again. The wound was self-inflicted first. Healing was already in receivership in 1969, already bleeding from decisions it had made entirely on its own. Selling the bicycle, buying the locomotives, years before the cheap imports arrived to deliver the final blow. The Japanese did not push a healthy company off the cliff. They arrived to find a company that had already walked most of the way to the edge under its own steam, and needed only a gentle push. And the locomotive gamble kept right on twisting the knife. The New South Wales 442 class locomotives that Goodwin was building, the first of them rolled out in October 1970, were rejected for riding too roughly and needed months of expensive rework on their bogies before the railways would accept them at all. That trouble came after the 1969 collapse, not before it, so it was not the cause of the fall. But it was another coffin nail, hammered in while the company was already flat on its back. Somehow, Healing clawed its way back from receivership. It steadied itself. It survived for a few more years as a wounded thing. And notice what that correction does to the way we normally tell these stories. We love a clean villain, the foreign predator, the greedy raider, the government that sold us out. Villains are comforting because a villain means the disaster was done to us and could have been stopped. But the truth about Healing is harder and more human than that. There was no one to hate. There was only a proud company, run by decent men, making a run of decisions that each looked reasonable on the day and proved catastrophic in some. That is how most great things actually die, not murdered in a single stroke. Mismanaged, slowly, and then overtaken. And then, at 7 o'clock on a Wednesday evening in July 1973, a government finished the job. Chapter 9. 7 o'clock, 18th of July. At 7 o'clock in the evening on Wednesday, the 18th of July 1973, the Prime Minister of Australia, Gough Whitlam, together with his Overseas Trade Minister, Jim Cairns, announced that the government was cutting every tariff in the country by 25%. Across the board, all at once, effective immediately from that midnight. For 80 years, the tariff wall had been the thing that made a company like Healing possible in the first place. Those protective duties were the whole reason it had been cheaper to build a radio in Melbourne than to ship one in from abroad. The reason Healing had started manufacturing at all, back in 1933, instead of simply importing. Behind that wall, Australian factories could pay Australian wages and still compete. Pulling it down was not a decision made lightly, and it was not made by fools. It was recommended by a secret 6-person committee, chaired by the head of the Tariff Board, Alf Rattigan, and driven by respected economists like Fred Gruen and Brian Brogan, men who genuinely believed protection had made Australian industry soft and lazy, and that the whole country would be richer in the long run for tearing the wall down. They may even have been right about the long run, but here is the problem with the long run. Real companies, full of real people who have to be paid on Friday, live in the short run. And in the short run, over the 7 years that followed that single evening's announcement, manufacturing employment in this country fell by 80,000 jobs. For A.G. Healing, already wounded, already leaning its full weight against that wall, the timing was simply fatal. The wall came down, and the flood of cheap imports it had been holding back came through all at once. And you can see the surrender written into the products themselves. By the mid-1970s, a Healing television, the model first designated 1201 and then renumbered 12001, was no longer a thing that Healing made. It was made in Japan and later carried under the HMV and EMY names entirely. Think about the distance travelled. The golden voice had once glowed amber inside a cabinet, built in Melbourne by Australian hands. Now the proud old name was just a badge, a sticker on the front of foreign hardware assembled on the far side of the world. That is the whole tragedy, compressed into a single object. Not a murder. Something quieter and sadder than a murder. And Healing was very far from alone in the wreckage. The same flood carried off the whole Australian electronics and appliance industry with it. The radio and television makers, the white goods firms, the proud old names of a whole industry. Japanese firms like Sony and National had spent the 1960s learning to build better sets for less, and once the wall was low enough, there was no answer to them. A country that had built its own radios through the Depression and its own radar through the war discovered, within a single decade, that it could no longer profitably build a television at all. Healing was merely the most complete casualty of the lot, because Healing had been the most complete company of the lot. Within 2 years, the name that had filled every Australian home was gone from the stock exchange altogether. Chapter 10. What Remains. Drive to Kensington in inner Melbourne and go along Racecourse Road, and the factory is still there. The streamlined, modern plant that Healing built against the law in 1943. The curved corners, the long, clean horizontal lines, still stands, protected now by a heritage overlay, repurposed and quiet. Go into the city, to Franklin Street, and the company's old headquarters, built in 1928, is still there too. It is a backpackers' hostel now, full of young travellers from the other side of the world who have not the faintest idea whose name was once on the door. There is no plaque on either building to tell you that this was the company which once filled every room of the Australian home. You would walk straight past both of them. Even the ending is oddly blurred. The company was delisted from the stock exchange on the 26th of June, 1974, and finally wound up around 1975, so that even the date of death is uncertain. The family's run was over after very nearly 80 years, and one correction, because getting it right matters more than telling a tidy story. There is a building in Preston, on St George Road, that people sometimes point to and call the Old Healing Factory. It is not. That building was purpose-built as Preston Technical School in 1937, designed by the government's chief architect, Percy Everett. It was a school. It was never a healing plant at all. The real healing works have mostly slipped clean out of the city's memory, and that forgetting is its own kind of ending. Today, Australian manufacturing makes up around 5% of the whole economy, down from nearly 14% in 1990 and around 15% in the 1970s, the decade healing died. We import the televisions now, the fridges, the washing machines, the bicycles, every room of the house, once again, only made somewhere else, by someone else, and shipped in. It is a strange thing to stand in front of a building that anonymous and know what it once held. There is no ruin here, no rubble, no drama to photograph, just a quiet, useful structure that has forgotten its own name, in a city that has forgotten it too. So here is where it leaves us. Somewhere in a shed in this country, tonight, a collector has restored a golden voice radio. He switches it on, and the valves warm, and the dial glows that same warm amber it glowed in 1,000 lounge rooms in 1956. It is, very nearly, the only place left in the world where the name still lights up. Think about what that small glow survived. It survived the Depression that broke half its rivals. It survived a world war. It built a factory against the law to help fight one. For 80 years, it beat back everything the century could throw at it, and then it did not survive the peace. It did not survive prosperity. It did not survive its own ambition, the selling of the bicycle, the buying of the locomotives. And it did not survive the quiet evening a government decided the wall could finally come down. A man began it with £50 borrowed from his sister and built that name into every single room of the Australian home. The radio still glows. The country that made it is somewhere else now.